It was a wild and stormy March morning in the year 1883 when a knock shattered the stillness of Baker Street. The fire crackled low, and Sherlock Holmes was seated in his chair, legs crossed, fingertips pressed together, as I read the morning paper beside him. The knock came again, hurried, almost frantic. Holmes looked up. "Unusual urgency, Watson. Would you mind?" I opened the door to reveal a young woman, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with fear. She wore a heavy cloak, soaked through from the rain, and clutched the edge of her hood with a trembling hand. "Mr. Holmes?" she asked, breathless. "Please come in," Holmes said, rising quickly. "Take the chair by the fire. You are chilled to the bone." She stepped into the warmth, her eyes darting about nervously. "My name is Helen Stoner," she said, voice low and taut. "I am in dreadful trouble, Mr. Holmes. Something terrible is going to happen." Holmes offered her a blanket and gestured for her to begin. "I live with my stepfather, Dr. Grimesby Roylott, at Stoke Moran. My twin sister died under mysterious circumstances 2 years ago, just weeks before her wedding. Last night, I heard the same whistle she heard the night she died." Holmes leaned forward. "You must start from the beginning." Helen took a deep breath. "My mother married Dr. Roylott when we were children. He was once a respected physician in India, but after returning to England he changed. He became violent, reclusive. We live in an old, crumbling estate. The estate is heavily mortgaged, but my sister and I had a small inheritance from our mother. We were to receive it upon marriage." She paused, and tears welled in her eyes. Julia, my sister, had become engaged. But 2 weeks before her wedding, she died. Suddenly, in her bedroom. She screamed in the night, and when I rushed to her, she collapsed in my arms. Her last words were, "It was the band, the Speckled band." Holmes sat still, his eyes narrowing. "And now," Helen continued, "I am to be married. But last night I heard it. That same low whistle in the night. I moved into Julia's old room, since my own is under repair, and now I fear I shall meet the same fate." Holmes stood, eyes sharp. "Miss Stoner, I believe your life is indeed in danger, but you are safe for now, and I promise you, we shall uncover what lies behind this speckled band." The storm had not yet lifted as we sat with Miss Helen Stoner in the warmth of our Baker Street sitting room. Her story weighed heavily on us, but it was the mention of the Speckled band that had stirred something deep within Holmes. He stood by the fire, pipe in hand, watching the smoke curl upward like a question not yet answered. "Miss Stoner," he said, turning sharply, "your stepfather, Dr. Roylott, did he act strangely after your sister's death?" She nodded. "He was silent for days. Then he lashed out, destroyed the furniture in her room, and forbade anyone from speaking of her. He refused an inquest beyond the doctor's report. They said she died of fright." "Fright?" Holmes repeated coldly. "A convenient diagnosis." Helen continued, "I've tried to move on, but the fear never left me, especially now that I've heard the same sound just before dawn. A whistle, low but clear. Julia said she heard it for nights before she died." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, make note of that. A recurring whistle at night, just before death." "Does Dr. Roylott know you come to me?" Holmes asked suddenly. Helen paled. "No, but he followed me to London. I took great care to lose him in the fog. I told no one I was coming here." At that moment, the front door slammed violently. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. Holmes's eyes flashed. "It seems, Miss Stoner, your stepfather is more clever than you think." Before Mrs. Hudson could announce him, the door burst open, and in strode a massive figure. Dr. Grimesby Roylott. He was tall and broad, with a face red from rage and whiskers like the bristles of a warthog. His eyes blazed. "So," he growled, "you are the meddler who dares interfere in my affairs." He stepped toward Holmes, towering, fists clenched. "I know you, Holmes. Keep out of my business, or you'll regret it. I am not a man to be crossed." Holmes remained calm, and yet here you are, threatening me in my own home. Roylott snarled, turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Helen trembled. "I'm sorry. I didn't think you would follow." Holmes gave a faint smile. "On the contrary, Miss Stoner, I was hoping he would. Now I've seen the man, and I've smelled India on his clothes." He turned to me. "Watson, prepare yourself. We travel to Stoke Moran at once." By noon the next day, Holmes and I boarded the train bound for Surrey. The clouds hung low, casting a gray pall over the countryside as fields and villages slipped past the window. Holmes was silent for most of the ride, his sharp gaze focused on nothing in particular, always a sign that his mind was working at full speed. "Watson," he finally said, "do you recall Julia Stoner's dying words?" "It was the band, the Speckled band," I replied. He nodded. "And the whistle?" "Heard at night." "Curious, isn't it? A band, possibly a visual detail, a whistle, an audible clue, and now a stepfather with a violent temper and a motive to keep both daughters from marrying and claiming their inheritance." "Do you suspect poison?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. There was no sign of it. No convulsions, no frothing. Something subtler, something crueler. We arrived at a small station surrounded by farmland and decay. Helen was waiting, cloaked and gloved. She led us through winding lanes until we arrived at the Stoke Moran. The house was grim. Its roof sagged like tired shoulders, and the walls were cracked and spotted with mildew. Ivy clung to the stone like veins on a corpse. A baboon wandered near the fence, and a cheetah lay lazily on the lawn. "Exotic pets," Holmes muttered. "What an eccentric creature Roylott is." "He brought them from India," Helen explained nervously. "They roam freely. I've grown used to avoiding them." She led us inside through a back entrance, careful not to be seen. We passed dusty halls, rooms filled with broken furniture and strange artifacts, skulls, masks, old weapons. At last, she showed us the two adjoining bedrooms, hers and the one that had belonged to Julia. Holmes examined every corner, walls, floors, ceilings, windows. He lingered by the bedstead, then by a bell rope that hung just above the pillow. "Odd," he said, tugging gently. "It's fastened. This bell doesn't ring at all. It's a dummy, meant to appear functional." He moved to the ventilator, an opening between the two rooms, just above the bed. "And here," he said darkly, "a vent that leads not to fresh air, but to another bedroom. Why would a ventilator be installed between two indoor rooms?" He turned to us, his face unreadable. "Miss Stoner, tonight Dr. Watson and I will return here, without your stepfather's knowledge. We must see what happens when the whistle blows." Helen looked afraid, but she nodded. Holmes placed a hand on her shoulder. "Fear not. This house has kept its secrets too long. Tonight we shall pull back the curtain." The sky had turned to a deep indigo by the time Holmes and I returned to Stoke Moran. Miss Stoner had prepared everything as instructed. She would sleep in a different part of the house that night, under the pretense of fearing a ceiling collapse in her room, an excuse that her stepfather had accepted without suspicion. Holmes and I slipped into Julia's old bedroom just after dusk. The shadows in the house seemed alive with tension, and every creak of the floorboards felt like a drumbeat before a storm. Holmes carried a small leather bag with him, from which he retrieved a dark lantern, a length of stout cord, and his revolver. "This, Watson," he said as he closed the door softly behind us, "may prove to be one of the most dangerous nights of our careers." "I'm prepared," I said, though I could feel my heart thudding against my ribs. We sat silently, lights extinguished, the room enveloped in blackness. Only a slit from Holmes's shuttered lantern remained, barely illuminating the strange features of the room, the dummy bell rope, the ventilator, and the bolted bed frame. The silence was overwhelming. The house, so full of strange objects and wilder creatures, was unnaturally still. Occasionally we heard the distant cry of the cheetah or the rattle of a window pane, but nothing more. For hours we waited. The air grew thick and stifling. Midnight passed, 1 o'clock, then 2. And then it came. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, a low, whistling hiss like steam escaping from a kettle. Holmes, suddenly alert, sprang up silently and raised his lantern toward the ventilator. His expression was sharpened to a knife's edge. He struck the bell rope with his cane and let out a short, fierce cry. "You scoundrel! We have you now!" At once, a terrible shriek rang out from the other room, a scream so high and wild it chilled my very blood. Then, a heavy crash and silence. Holmes flung open the door and rushed down the hallway. I followed, heart hammering in my chest. We burst into Dr. Roylott's chamber. The scene before us froze us in place. The man lay slumped in a chair, death etched into every muscle of his rigid body. His eyes bulged, his lips were drawn back in a silent snarl of agony, and coiled around his forehead, like a crown from hell, a speckled snake. Holmes stepped forward carefully, unshaken. "The speckled band," he whispered grimly. Dr. Grimesby, Roylott, was dead. He sat stiff in the high-backed chair, his neck rigid, his lips purple with the swelling of poison. But what drew the eye, what froze the breath in one's chest, was the creature draped across his head like a grotesque garland. A swamp adder, the deadliest snake in India. Holmes moved first. With precise caution, he took the poker from the fireplace and nudged the serpent gently. It hissed, recoiled, and slithered back toward the small metal safe affixed to the wall. Holmes snapped it shut just as the creature vanished inside. "There," he said, exhaling. "Let us not have that thing loose in the house." I stared at the lifeless figure. "He's truly dead?" "Beyond any help," Holmes said coldly. He turned away from the body and began scanning the room methodically. "We now see the full horror of his plan." Holmes stepped to a saucer of milk placed carelessly on the floor near the safe. "He trained it," Holmes explained, his voice grim. "Fed it here, conditioned it to respond to the whistle. He would release it through the ventilator at night, down the dummy bell rope, onto the bed. If it killed, it was silent. If not, he could call it back with the whistle." I shuddered. "He used a venomous snake as a murder weapon?" Holmes nodded. "Ingenious in its cruelty. No sound, no trace, and if the bite didn't strike true, he simply tried again the next night." He looked toward the adjoining room. "Julia's death makes sense now. She heard the whistle in the night. She saw something, perhaps the snake itself, and in her final delirious moments, cried out about the speckled band. But why would he kill his stepdaughters?" Holmes's eyes hardened. "Money. Greed. If either married, part of their inheritance would slip from his control. So he murdered Julia, and now intended to do the same to Helen." I leaned heavily against the doorway, horrified. "And tonight?" I asked. "Why did it attack him instead?" Holmes permitted himself a grim smile. I struck the bell rope just as it was descending. Startled, it must have recoiled through the ventilator back into his room, and struck him instead. Poetic justice, I suppose. The house fell into silence once more, broken only by the sound of rain against the windows and the soft hiss of the dying fire. Holmes turned to me. "Come, Watson. We've done what we came to do." We left the dead man behind, the horror extinguished, but the memory of that silent weapon would haunt us long after. The morning light was breaking as Holmes and I walked away from the Stoke Moran. The sky was painted with cold hues of gray and gold, and the mist had begun to lift from the moors. Behind us, that cursed house stood still and silent. Its shadow stretched long across the earth. Neither of us spoke for some time. Holmes's hands were tucked behind his back, his head slightly bowed. I could see the weight of what we'd just witnessed pressing on him, not just the violence of it, but the layers of deception, fear, and cruelty that had brought us there. At last, I broke the silence. "Do you think the authorities will believe what happened?" "They must," Holmes said. "There will be the corpse, the snake in the safe, the ventilator, and the bell rope. It tells itself, if one knows how to read it." "And Helen?" I asked. "She is safe now," he said, "thanks to her courage in coming to us. But I fear the scars of that house may remain with her longer than she expects." We reached the station and boarded the early train back to London. The motion of the carriage and the warm light inside offered some contrast to the horrors of the night, but I could not shake the image of Dr. Roylott's twisted figure, or the snake coiled upon him like an executioner's rope. Holmes remained silent for the first hour of our journey. Then, gazing out the window, he said softly, "Roylott was a clever man, but cleverness without conscience is a danger to all." He tapped his fingers against the window pane. He believed himself beyond consequence, above the law. He used nature itself as his weapon, and in the end, nature turned against him. "I suppose justice was served," I said. Holmes shook his head gently. "Justice, perhaps, but it was not clean. Julia should not have died, nor should Helen have lived under that shadow. No victory brings back what was lost." There was a pause. Then he added, "But at least now, the speckled band is broken." As London came into view once more, I saw Holmes retrieve his notebook. He opened to a blank page and wrote a single line at the top. "Stoke Moran, the House of Silence, Snakes, and Secrets." Then he closed the book without another word. Back at 200-21 B. Baker Street, the familiar warmth of home was a welcome change after the grim chill of Stoke Moran. Mrs. Hudson had prepared tea, but even that familiar ritual could not fully erase the memory of what we'd seen. Holmes stood by the window, arms folded, staring out at the damp street below. "I cannot stop hearing her scream, Watson," he said quietly. "Julia's?" He nodded. That final cry. The band, the speckled band. It was a message. A desperate attempt to name her killer. It took 2 years and a snakebite meant for another to understand it. I sat near the fire, feeling the weight of the case press down on me. "You saved Helen's life? That has to mean something." Holmes turned slowly. "It does. But it also reminds me how long the truth can remain buried, even when it cries out for justice." He took a small object from his coat pocket. A twisted length of rope snapped from the bedpost at Stoke Moran. "This," he said, "was no bell rope. It was a bridge. A passage from the vent to the bed, designed for death to slither unseen." He placed it on the table beside the notes he had taken, sketches of the ventilator, the room layout, and the snake's coiling path. "What now?" I asked. Holmes lit his pipe and leaned back. "Now we write it down. This case must be remembered, not only for its horror but for the lesson it teaches. He began dictating slowly. It is not always the brute who strikes with a fist who is the most dangerous. Sometimes evil slithers. It waits in silence. It smiles in the daylight, and in darkness it kills. His voice lowered. And sometimes justice does not come in courtrooms, but in the quiet collapse of a man destroyed by his own design. We both sat for a long time after that, each of us seeing Stoke Moran again behind closed eyes. The cracked walls, the metallic hiss of the safe door, the lifeless body, and the mask of terror Julia had worn in death. But beneath that horror was something more powerful, the sound of a secret finally uncovered. And in that, at least, there was peace. A few days after our return, a modest envelope arrived at Baker Street, addressed to Mr. Sherlock Holmes in elegant handwriting. Holmes opened it with a practiced flick of his fingers, scanned the contents briefly, and handed it to me. It was from Helen Stoner. Dear Mr. Holmes, I am writing to thank you, not just for saving my life, but for restoring a piece of my sister's dignity. For 2 long years I lived under the shadow of her death, believing it was a mystery the world had forgotten. Now I know the truth, and I am no longer afraid. Stoke Moran has been shut, the animals are gone, and I intend never to return. Gratefully yours, Helen. Holmes folded the letter, placed it beside his notes, and returned to his chair. She is free now, he said. The house was a prison of the past. With Roylott gone, so too goes the fear. I nodded. She mentioned the inheritance. Will she receive it now? Yes, Holmes replied. Both Julia's portion and her own. There will be an inquiry, of course, but the facts are irrefutable. The snake, the fake bell rope, the ventilator, all of it was meticulously designed, and it killed its master. Holmes stood and moved to his violin. He drew the bow softly across the strings, producing a long, melancholic note. I cannot help but wonder, he said, what drove Roylott to that method? Why not poison or a staged accident? Why something so theatrical? I offered a theory. Perhaps he thought the exotic nature of the weapon would hide it better. No fingerprints, no sound, no trace. Holmes nodded. Perhaps, or perhaps he thought himself untouchable. An extension of nature's wildness. He lived among beasts and became one. He played again. This time a slow, haunting tune, full of tension and regret. I stared into the fire and saw the flicker of a candle in a girl's bedroom, the slither of scales, and the final desperate scream of a woman who only wanted to live long enough to be married. She tried to warn them, I whispered. And thanks to Helen, and to you, she finally has. Holmes lowered the violin and looked into the flame. Yes, he said. Some ghosts do not seek revenge. They seek resolution. The days that followed were quieter than usual. Holmes declined 3 cases, saying simply, I've had enough of darkness for now. But he wasn't idle. He spent his time refining his notes on Stoke Moran, consulting books on Indian fauna, and sketching diagrams of the bell rope mechanism and ventilator. I returned one afternoon to find him hunched over a folio of snake species. You're still thinking about it? I asked. He didn't look up. The swamp adder. It puzzles me. Wasn't it the deadliest snake in India? That's just it, Holmes said, tapping his pen against the page. There's no real record of such a species by that name. It may have been Roylott's personal term, or a local name for an extremely venomous variety, rarely encountered. Does it matter? I asked. To the case? No. But to my curiosity, immensely. He leaned back. Think of it, Watson. A man importing such a creature, training it, weaponizing it with a whistle and a saucer of milk. Milk? I asked. Would a snake even drink milk? Holmes allowed himself a brief smirk. Not typically, but perhaps it learned the ritual. Snakes don't obey commands, but they follow patterns. Roylott likely built habits into the creature, enough to use it, and enough to be destroyed by it. He turned toward the window, watching as the fog crept in over Baker Street. Evil, when dressed in the cloth of genius, becomes all the more dangerous. Roylott was no madman. He was methodical, calculating, and utterly without remorse. I sat down, but in the end his plan backfired. Holmes's gaze darkened. Only after claiming one life. There was a silence between us, heavy with the weight of the unsaid. Holmes finally whispered, almost to himself. I wonder if he ever regretted it. If, in the moments before his death, he thought of Julia's face, her scream. The violin remained untouched that day. Instead, Holmes took the letter from Helen and placed it gently inside his casebook, between the pages marked The Speckled Band, a bookmark of sorrow, a reminder of how even the most brilliant minds can be devoured by their own design. The wind rattled the windows of 221B Baker Street as Holmes and I sat in the soft flicker of lamplight. A week had passed since the case, and though the public knew little of the events at Stoke Moran, Holmes had received a quiet acknowledgment from the local magistrate. They've accepted the explanation? I asked. Holmes nodded, folding a letter. The coroner's report confirmed death by snakebite. The evidence we left behind, the damaged bell rope, the ventilator, the snake itself, all pointed to Roylott's guilt. The inquest is closed. Officially, an unfortunate accident. Unfortunate, I echoed, but strangely just. Holmes turned toward the fireplace, his voice softer than usual. Justice is not always loud, Watson. Sometimes it's silent. A single locked safe, a whistle in the dark. A man struck down by the very danger he unleashed. He stood and paced slowly. I've seen murderers caught in the act, liars brought low in court, but Roylott, he constructed his crime like a craftsman. A silent assassin, cold-blooded, literally. I watched him carefully. Does it haunt you? Not the outcome, he replied, but the subtlety, the precision. It chills me that someone could murder with such quiet confidence, and so nearly succeed again. I nodded. And if Helen had stayed silent, if she hadn't come to you, she would be dead, Holmes finished. He opened his casebook again where Helen's letter still rested like a keepsake. This case, he said, reminds me why our work matters. Not to bring glory or headlines, but to protect those who have no one else. A frightened woman, a forgotten sister, a cry that lingered in the air for 2 years. He added another line to the case notes. Let no whistle in the night go unheard, and no cry in the dark go unanswered. There was a long pause. Then Holmes looked to me. Watson, I need air. Would you care for a walk? I nodded, glad for the suggestion. We stepped out into the London fog, coats drawn tight, and disappeared into the night. 2 men who had seen justice done not by sword or cell, but by vigilance, compassion, and a moment's courage. Behind us, the snake was dead. But the memory of the speckled band would never fade. Our walk through London's damp and winding streets that night was a silent one. Holmes moved with his usual purpose, though I could tell his thoughts were elsewhere, back in the dim halls of Stoke Moran, no doubt, or in the last echoes of a whistle heard in the dark. Watson, he said at last, stopping beneath a flickering gas lamp, do you know what makes the most dangerous criminal? I shook my head. Not rage, he said, not greed, but certainty, absolute belief in their own impunity. Roylott didn't kill in desperation. He killed with the confidence of a man who believed no one would ever see the hand behind the crime. "And if not for Helen?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "He would have succeeded again, and we would be left with another silent room, another death certificate, and no explanation." The streets around us were quiet. A newsboy passed with the evening edition, shouting headlines of war, of politics, nothing of murder by venom or strange deaths in country manners. No one would ever read about the Speckled band. "Sometimes I think the world is too eager for spectacle," Holmes said. "Gunshots, manhunts, trials, but the true evils, they slither beneath notice." We turned back toward Baker Street. The air had grown colder. Inside, Holmes returned to his notes. He drew a sketch, simple and haunting. A bed, a bell rope, a ventilator, and curling from it, a pattern of coils with a spotted band. He labeled it The Silent Killer. "Will you publish this one?" I asked. Holmes was quiet. Then, "Perhaps, but not now. Some truths are too cruel for the public appetite." Instead, he placed the sketch inside his private folio. Unpublished cases. The drawer closed with a soft click. Later, as I prepared for bed, Holmes stood by the window looking out into the dark. He said, almost to himself, "The most chilling sound is not the scream of the victim, but the silence of those who never saw it coming." The whistle would never be heard again, but its echo would remain. Morning sunlight poured into 221B Baker Street, casting golden shapes on the floor. The events of Stoke Moran were now behind us, closed to the world, buried in silence, but within the pages of Holmes's casebook they would live forever. Holmes sat in his chair, flipping through his notes one last time before sealing the file. He moved with the precision of a man finishing a ritual, binding not just paper, but memory. "I've often been asked," he said, not looking up, "which case has left the deepest impression on me." "And this is it?" I asked. He closed the folder slowly. "Yes, not because it was the most complex, but because it was the most human." I nodded. "You saw into the heart of a murderer." "And into the soul of a victim," he replied. "Julia Stoner died trying to speak the truth. Her sister survived because she dared to listen to it." He stood and placed the file in the locked cabinet labeled "Private Records for Publication Upon Death," a rare designation. "There are many kinds of evil, Watson," he continued. "The thief who steals in the night, the liar who manipulates from behind the curtain. But Roylott was different. He used silence as a weapon, darkness as his accomplice, nature as his executioner." Holmes crossed the room, gently lifting his violin. He played a single soft note, then let it drift. "And yet, in the end, he was destroyed by the very thing he controlled. There's a kind of poetry in that." I walked to the window, watching the London streets come alive. "Helen Stoner wrote again yesterday," I said. "She and her fiancé have left for the coast. They're to be married by spring." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then the dead no longer rule the living. That is justice enough." For a long time we said nothing more. The fire crackled. Outside, life moved forward. And behind us, sealed in ink and ash, was the story of a whistle in the dark, a band of speckled death, and the night Sherlock Holmes stopped evil without ever drawing his gun. Some cases are trophies, others are warnings, but this one was a reminder that sometimes the most brilliant mind must bow to the quiet voice of a terrified woman.